Right, this is video 2 of 4 of section B, unit 1. So we're looking at recovery of energy systems using EPOC and nutritional strategies. This video contains information on EPOC only. Nutritional strategies will be in a separate video. EPOC stands for excess post-exercise consumption, which means basically oxygen that you can consume and utilise after you've finished your exercise session to replace what you would have liked to have had at the start of exercise but didn't because your breathing rate, heart rate and breathing depth were not high enough initially. So think about it. When you start exercise, think about what we learned in section A7. What systems will you use? What energy systems? Can you think about when you sprint in a football match whilst marking a player for maybe 45 seconds or more, and what energy systems you would use to achieve that? Hopefully you've thought, yes, we're going to use the anaerobic systems. I would use the ATP-PC system for the first part of the exercise or anything that is very, very intense for a short period of time, and I would use the lactate system for anything that's moderate to high intensity that I'd be using for 45 seconds up to minutes long, so marking a player, for example. Now, what do we know about the ATP-PC system? How long does it last for? And what is the source of energy? If you're stuck on this, you need to go back to the video of section A7. So what we know about ATP-PC is that it lasts for 8 to 10 seconds, and the source of energy that we use is phosphocreatine, hence the PC, it's the phosphocreatine. So if we're using the phosphocreatine for the ATP-PC system, then we are going to need to replace it. And this is where oxygen comes in, and we refer back to the title. Excess post, after we finished exercise consumption, taking in of oxygen after we finished exercise. So oxygen is required for us to recreate or resynthesize phosphocreatine from the substance of phosphate and creatine. And it's a complicated process using adenosine triphosphate that we don't need to know for this specification. What we do need to remember is to resynthesize phosphocreatine, we require oxygen and rest. We get this excess oxygen from having an elevated breathing rate and an elevated breathing depth, and alongside that an increased heart rate. After the exercise that we are taking part in, the intensity of that reduces, so we are able to keep our breathing rate higher than is required for the current intensity of exercise. So it doesn't necessarily mean that EPOC happens at the end of the activity when you're in the changing rooms, but it means it can happen whenever there's a reduction in intensity of the activity. So let's review what we know about the lactate system. How long does the lactate system last for? What intensities do we use it for? What waste product is produced when we use the lactate system? And how does that waste product harm the muscle contraction? So we know it lasts for 30 seconds to a number of minutes of high intensity exercise or moderate to high intensity exercise like marking a player. We produce lactic acid as a result of creating energy through the lactate system, and for recap on A7, this is through glycolysis when it goes to pyruvate and there is not enough oxygen to convert it to acetyl coenzyme A and go into the Krebs cycle. So it goes from pyruvate and it goes into the bloodstream there and dissociates into lactate and hydrogen ions. So how does it harm muscle contraction? We learnt this last lesson. So the hydrogen ions reduce the pH of the blood and can disrupt the electrical signals going through the motor neuron to tell the muscle to contract in the first place. And we talked about acetylcholine being reduced and things like that as well in terms of just general fatigue. If this is not ringing bells, have another listen through the last video. So we need to get rid of this lactate, or this lactic acid, which is lactate and hydrogen. And the way we get rid of it is by using oxygen again. So this oxygen we get after we've finished or reduced our intensity of exercise, and it's the excess oxygen that we are then consuming, again keeping elevated breathing rate, breathing depth and heart rate. Any oxygen consumed after exercise or in a reduction of intensity below our maximum is referred to as EPOC, excess post-exercise consumption. So let's have a look at this in the form of a graph. So we've got the EPOC graph here. This is the point that we are starting our exercise, and this is the point that we are stopping. So we have time along the x-axis, and we've got consumption of oxygen on the y-axis. So we're starting exercising, and all of a sudden our oxygen consumption is increasing. It's increasing and levelling off, because actually we're working to our maximum here and it's levelling off and we can't get much more, and we are consuming as much oxygen as our body will allow. This shaded blue area represents oxygen that we needed but didn't have. If in an ideal world, the minute you start exercising and you know you're going to be exercising at full pelt, your breathing rate, your heart rate, your breathing depth, all of your gaseous exchange mechanisms would ideally work at full rate straight away, enabling us to get this level of oxygen uptake straight away at the onset of exercise. But we know that doesn't happen. We know that it takes us a little while to get into our exercise, and while we're getting into our exercise and we're getting all our energy systems up and running, we cause this deficit. So this is our oxygen deficit. When we've finished our exercise, or we've reduced the intensity, so we're in a resting state, and it may be standing waiting for a player after you've repositioned, or it could be half time, our oxygen consumption does decrease, but slowly. So we keep an elevated breathing rate and heart rate for quite some time after exercise. Now this occurs more so if we have an active cool down as well. So if we keep walking around, or we keep stretching, or we're doing some mobilising exercises. This area here now represents EPOC. That's what EPOC is. This represents the amount of oxygen that is consumed after exercise, or when there's a reduction in intensity of exercise, to replace what we should have had at the beginning. But essentially what it will do is replace your phosphocreatine, your ATP, your myoglobin, and it will take away any lactic acid that you may have. The graph is split into two sections. You can see this yellow section just behind you here, and you can see the red section along here. The yellow section is showing the fast components, those things that recover quickly. It's the amount of oxygen that we need to synthesize the phosphagens of our muscle. Now the phosphagens refers to resynthesizing phosphocreatine and replenishing adenosine triphosphate in the muscle cell, of which we have about 2 seconds worth. It's relatively quick and takes about 3 minutes in total. And in 30 seconds, you can replenish almost 15% of your phosphocreatine, which is how we can explain that we can repeat fast sprints continuously over a match of, say, 90 minutes. Now, what it doesn't quite explain is what happens when you have exercised over 90 minutes and your sprints aren't as fast at the end of the match as they were at the beginning. Now, we've talked about this in lessons. So if we say these are phosphocreatine stores on the y-axis and time along the x-axis here, and we start with our phosphocreatine stores fully stocked up right up at the top here. We do our first sprint for say 5 seconds. We don't deplete our stores, but we reduce them. But then we have a rest period. So there's no high intensity exercise. As long as we're breathing, we've got that elevated breathing rate and we're breathing more than we need to for that intensity of exercise, our phosphocreatine will start to replenish. Then we are called upon to do another sprint or a tackle or a header, and we will drop off phosphocreatine levels. And again, given the time, we can start to recover. Now, given enough time, we can replenish those completely. If we are not given enough time, or we've done 10 seconds of exercise and completely depleted them, then our phosphocreatine stores will reduce dramatically. And it will take us 3 minutes to completely replenish. So this is indicative of the duration and the intensity of the exercise. The longer the duration, so up to 10 seconds, or the higher the intensity, the quicker your phosphocreatine stores will reduce. Given the time at rest and you're consuming that excess oxygen, this recovery can occur within a match situation or at the end of a match. The red section on the graph is representing these slow components, and the slow components refers to the removal of lactic acid. This can take up to 2 hours, but it depends on the duration and the intensity of the exercise. So if you have worked for, say, 4 hours in total and the intensity was high intensity frequently throughout those 4 hours, but obviously not for the whole time, then you will have created a lot of lactic acid, and therefore it would probably take you a full 2 hours to get rid of it. If you only played for 15 minutes of the game, even if it was a hard 15 minutes, it would probably only take an hour to remove that lactic acid. It takes approximately just 15 minutes to remove about 50% of that lactic acid, and a majority of it has been converted after at least 1 hour. Interesting fact that some lactic acid actually is reversed or converted back to glycogen through something called the Cori cycle that occurs in the liver. The remaining lactic acid gets converted back into pyruvate, and at this point now, with the available oxygen, because of the excess consumption and our reduced intensity, it can now enter Krebs cycle. This is the aerobic system, so if it enters the aerobic system, we are converting what was the glucose that went to lactic acid that's now come back into the system and is converted into carbon dioxide, sweat as water, and the rest is resynthesized into ATP to replenish those stores or to use for any minor muscle contractions that we may still be having. So can you take a couple of minutes to have a look at this graph again, draw it out and label the oxygen deficit, the slow components, the fast components, and list what happens in the fast component and in the slow component. So pause the video, please. So the other things that we need to do after we finish exercise is replenish our glycogen stores. So some lactic acid, as I mentioned briefly before, is converted back into glycogen via something called the Cori cycle. This isn't in our specifications, it's just for knowledge, and it occurs in the liver. The rest will be restored through diet, and it's highly recommended that you eat a predominantly carbohydrate meal within 2 hours, and that would restore a majority of your glycogen for your next exercise session. It can take between 2 and 48 hours, again depending on the duration and the intensity. The longer the duration, the higher the intensity, the longer the recovery. Finally, we've got myoglobin. Now, we haven't talked about this too much, but myoglobin is a protein that is within the muscle cell, and it is used to hold on to oxygen that can then be used for the aerobic system to resynthesize adenosine triphosphate. An interesting fact about myoglobin is it has a higher affinity for oxygen than hemoglobin. So it's one of the reasons that the oxygen will come off the hemoglobin and go into the muscle cell during exercise. This myoglobin is quite simply replenished with oxygen after all the other components are completed. This means you've got oxygen in the muscle cell ready for the next time your intensity of exercise or movement starts to increase. So a quick question for you then. Why do we need an active warm down? What does a warm down do for breathing rate and breathing depth? What does it do with your heart rate and blood flow and even your blood vessels? We need to consider what impact those things above have on oxygen delivery and carbon dioxide removal. So pause the video and write down your answer, please. Okay, let's look at the answers. What does a cool down do for breathing rate and depth? Well, if you do an active cool down or warm down, presumably you're still walking, you've just reduced your intensity. The breathing rate will then stay elevated. The breathing depth will then still be deeper than normal resting. Heart rate will be elevated and blood flow will still be increased to a higher level than resting rates. Blood vessels to the working muscles and to the skin will remain dilated. So the impact of this is that more oxygen than we need for the intensity of exercise that we are doing, which should be resting at this point or a very light walk, there should be excess oxygen that can be delivered to the working muscles to replenish the phosphocreatine stores and to convert that lactic acid back into pyruvate. And it should assist with the removal of carbon dioxide. And given that some of that lactic acid goes through the aerobic system in recovery, we're going to still be producing carbon dioxide, more so than we would do at normal resting rates. So how does intensity and duration impact recovery time? Can you consider both the slow and the fast components in your answer and give me a short answer? Pause the video. Okay, so if the duration is long, then recovery will take a longer time. If intensity is high, the recovery will take a longer time. And that's essentially it. If you are asked a question in relation to a sport, you must consider the demands of that sport and relate your recovery accordingly. So the time of the match, the type of work that you have to do, being in the position that you are if it's mentioned. The second part of section B2 is about nutritional strategies for recovery. This is on video 3.